mic on. Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to the Development Committee, 28th of June 2018. First of all, our usual evacuation announcement. Should we be required to evacuate the building, would you please leave the building via the nearest available exit to the chamber. Our assembly point is in the public car park at the side of the Civic Suite. Please don't delay your evacuation to collect belongings. And please don't return into the building until given permission to do so by a member of council staff. Please note that the meeting is audio recorded, and if you have a mobile, please turn it off or to silent, please. Item 1, our apologies for absence. They've been received from Councillor Mrs Hoy and Councillor Milne, who is substituted by Councillor Gooding. So that also covers two substitute members, as just said, Councillor Gooding. Non-members attending, we've got Councillor Lucas Gill. Minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of May 2018. You're happy for me to sign those as a correct and accurate record of that meeting? Thank you. Item 5, declarations of interest. You're going to go first.
Bear with me, I've just got a short statement to read out for the public record. Items 7 and 8 relate to council offices at 19 South Street, Rochford. Members of the Development Committee are being asked to determine an application by their own authority. The matter of members' interests and the dual role for some members who also sit on the investment board and within the Wyvern project team has been considered ahead of this application. The monitoring officer has considered whether members of this committee have an interest in any business of the authority. Such members have a non-pecuniary interest. Members of the investment board who are making decisions to progress projects as part of the council's policy to maximise assets under the business plan may be predisposed to consider an application at the development committee in a certain way. However, any decision taken by the investment board does not take into account material planning considerations and does not show a predetermination on the part of those members. I would therefore invite investment board members, that includes previous investment board members present tonight, to disclose that they have a non-pecuniary interest. For members who have been on the Project Wyvern team, your role goes further as you have actively participated in progressing the project to the Development Committee. It is the objective of the project team to obtain approval of the application, and as such it can be considered that you would be predetermined. For those members who are present this evening, please withdraw from the chamber for this item. You may be allowed to listen to the officer's presentation and have 5 minutes to speak if you so wish. Thank you.
Councillor Steptoe.
Declare a non-pecuniary interest as chair of the investment board.
Mr. Weston.
I'm not on the investment board now. I was, so it's a non-pecuniary interest.
Councillor Williams.
Non-pecuniary interest, member of the investment board and chairman of Rochford Parish Council.
Thank you. Councillor Arno.
As a portfolio for enterprise and member of the investment board, I will be leading the chamber for the nominations discussion.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Non-pecuniary interest as a member of the investment board.
Thank you. Councillor Hookway.
Non-pecuniary interest as a previous member of the investment board.
Councillor Lucas Gill.
Non-pecuniary interest being a member of the investment board.
Okay. Councillor Gooding.
Non-pecuniary interest because I'm on the investment board.
Thank you. Right. Okay, thank you very much. Can I just check that everybody has seen the addendum, which it's an addendum to items 7 and 10? Yeah, everyone's clear with that. Okay, thank you. I do understand that most of our visitors are here for one of the later items, but there's a bit of a few worries about our fragile IT not coping with it, things not being in sequence in which they're loaded, so we're going to have to stick with the running order for this evening. So, item 6, Cherry Orchard Brickworks, Cherry Orchard Way, Rochford.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is that microphone okay to be on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Chairman, members, this application relates to the site edged red here. The site is east of Cherry Orchard Way and wraps around a row of terrace properties on the western boundary. The northern boundary runs immediately adjacent to the Nobles Green Brook, and the southern boundary runs immediately adjacent to a site to the south, which already has outline planning permission as part of the wider business park. If I can take you to plan number 2, please. Yep. This is the proposals map for the Joint Area Action Plan for the development envisaged around the airport and environs. The application site is here. And is part of the allocation for a high-quality business park and is identified as Area 1 on that allocation. These 2 areas to the south, 2 and 3, are already subject to outline planning permission. I can take you to the existing site layout, please. The site was historically in use as a brickworks, but no buildings associated with this use remain. I can take you through a few photographs. These were taken some time ago, so in different weather conditions. This is looking south, so this is boarding that runs along part of the western boundary of the site, and then Cherry Orchard Way is just off to the right-hand side of the screen here. This is the row of terrace cottages that the site wraps around to the east, and then there's another part of the site that just runs along the Nobles Green Brook, just to that boundary there. This is an existing public right-of-way that is relevant to the application because there is proposed some monies related to improvements to public footpaths in the vicinity that might include sort of upgrade and investment in this section. If I take you to the next one, this shows that this public footpath then links the site quite closely to an underpass access. This is currently closed, but might be opened up in the future with investment, and that then accesses the council's Cherry Orchard Country Park to the west. This is the actual site, so this is the row of terrace cottages, so this is looking northwards to that elevation, and as you can see there are no existing buildings on the site. The site's relatively flat, and some piles of rubble because some of demolition has occurred over the years. This is the other side elevation of that row of terrace properties, and there is an existing access point here. You might see just in the background, and the next photo I think shows it more clearly. One of the next photos, this is a sort of substation that's just to the rear of one of the terrace properties. They are proposing to sort of keep something like that in the layout. And then this is within the site, so this is near to the northern boundary. These piles of rubble, things have been sort of demolished on the site and left. There's no active use on the site at the present. So this is the northern boundary alongside the Nobles Green Brook, where the site's drainage would go to. Again, if you can, it's adjacent to the north is some football playing fields. Is that the last one, Mike? And then if we can take you to the proposed site access, please. So the application is an outline application with all matters reserved apart from vehicle access points to the site. So this is the site's southwestern boundary, which is immediately adjacent to the site to the south granted planning permission already. As part of this application to the south, a new roundabout access that has already been constructed on Cherry Orchard Way was built, and then part of the main access route through that site was part of that outline permission. That is required to join up to the northern boundary and provide an access point to the site that we're discussing tonight. So there's 2 points of access to the site to the south proposed as this part in this application, and this existing access point off Cherry Orchard Way would remain, but only to access the part of the site that's going to be, or the unit that would be in the southwestern corner. Essex County Council Highways Authority are satisfied with the proposal in terms of the 2 access points, but do want the main roundabout access to be the key access and the kind of primary access to the new business park taken together. So what they would require by condition is that once this access point was installed, there would be requirement to sort of close off off this ability to run through that road point there. If I can take you to the illustrative master plan, please. As the application is an outline with all matters reserved apart from access, all other matters in terms of layout, scale, landscaping, are all matters that would be determined at a later reserved matters application stage. But this plan is provided just to give context and show how the proposed development could be accommodated within the site and how it would link to the wider site to the south. If you could take you to the illustrative site layout, please, Mike. So whilst layout is not for determination at the outline stage, an illustrative plan has nevertheless been provided, and officers have commented back in the course of the application, and this is the third amendment to this plan. This has responded to some comments by officers. The open space within the site has been more effectively positioned within the site so that it would benefit potential users. They have included an access point to the eastern boundary to enable future development within this part of the Area 1 allocation, which isn't part of the same ownership or part of this proposal, to be accessed at a later date. This is important because we need to ensure that the proposed development here doesn't mean that we can't ensure that the remainder of the allocation is able to be developed at a later date. Also, small changes to the layout have been achieved, removing sort of overly dominant parking. Officers would, however, seek further improvements to this layout if it were to come forward at a reserved matter stage, in particular, perhaps increased separation from the rear elevation of the terrace properties to this unit here. We'd look for that to be achieved, and the breaking up of some of the quite significantly large swathes of car parking with some greater degree of landscaping. But overall, this layout is not for members to determine tonight. It's just to show how the amount of development could be accommodated within the site. This layout shows the proposal for an attenuation basin, so there would be some sustainable urban drainage achieved. There are several conditions required from Essex County Council to provide more detail of that by condition. The mix of uses, however, is for determination in this outline application and has changed in the course of the application responding to officer comments. The mix now proposed is predominantly B1, office accommodation, which aligns with the vision of the Joint Area Action Plan, which is to create a high-quality business park for the district with significant employment opportunities. The amount of B2, more general industrial, and B8 has now actually not reduced, it's completely eliminated. So what you've got before you is a proposal for B1 office accommodation, a small element of D1 education, which would be a nursery facility, a small amount of A3 cafe restaurant, D2 gymnasium, and those elements we as officers say are ancillary to the main B1 use that is proposed. There are two significant financial contributions that will be required, the main one relating to the provision of a bus service to the site, and the other relating to upgrading of the existing cycle and walking network, and the applicant has agreed to both of those in principle. The recommendation, Chairman, is therefore one of approval, subject to the legal agreement and conditions as detailed in the officer report.
Okay. Right, thank you, members. Then I'll start off on this. As far as looking at it is concerned, the particular matters that we're looking at over access, in particular, I think with the roundabout already in place, I think most people have accepted that is something that can work. The mix of use matches what we're seeking to achieve in our area action plan. Although it's not to be determined tonight, I feel that an informative should be added to help when parking gets discussed at the reserved matters stage. I do note the contribution to Essex County Council towards bus service and infrastructure enhancements. We've talked about the cycleway and the walkway and so on. But I do feel that B1 office use is going to attract a significant amount of vehicle movements. We have maximum standards, and I would not seek to exceed those, but I would seek an informative in the in any decision that we make that ensures that the parking provision at least matches that in the other half of the park. So that's just one small thing from me. Councillor Steptoe.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just a couple of points of clarification, if I may, please. I'm not sure exactly where it is on the diagram here, on the plan, but is there a bridleway adjacent to this site, or is it on the other side of Cherry Orchard Way? I'm not sure exactly where it is. First point.
On the other side of Cherry Orchard Way. So yes, there is a bridleway in the vicinity, but not immediately sort of adjacent to the site. The development would itself wouldn't affect that bridleway.
Thank you. Now, with regards to the brook running along the, I think it was the northern boundary, and obviously where the attenuation tanks will go in, obviously they will feed into that, but that's something to deal with at a later date. What conditions are placed on it for any work done on the site to prepare it for that point to stop any contamination into that brook? Because I believe that runs straight into the Roach, I believe.
So my environmental health colleagues required the standard set of land contamination conditions, so they are all detailed in the recommendation now. So they would have to submit details to us before they started the development on the site, and then obviously there'd be also licences required with the Environment Agency to drain into that brook at the moment. My understanding is there is actually no drainage at the moment into that brook, but that would be their intention for that attenuation pond and the drainage to be capped at a certain rate into that brook, agreed with the Environment Agency and Essex County as well.
Okay. Councillor Weston.
Thank you, Chairman. I noticed in one of the photographs you had a very high telegraph pole on that site. Can you just explain, is that going to be left there, and how will are there plans to put all the wiring for the electrics and telephones under the ground as well, please?
They haven't provided details with that in the application. So clearly, in one of those photos, and if we get it back up, but there are existing overhead sort of cables. The developer would have to look at that, but I don't think it's for us to determine at the outline planning stage. They would have to deal with that and deal with the companies as required, but they haven't provided details at the moment.
Okay. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Chairman. The proposed bus service, will that be coming onto the site itself or running along Cherry Orchard Lane?
So when we dealt with the outline application, we dealt with the outline planning application for the site to the south, and there are requirements in that for bus stops within the site. So to take you to the illustrative master plan might show that best. Yeah, so this is the site to the south that benefits from outline planning consent already, and in that was set a condition requiring 2 bus stops within that site. And on that basis, the intention is for the bus to actually come and loop through the site, but I think the County Council take the view that the walk from the bus stops within this site would be adequate to serve the application site we're talking about tonight. So what we wouldn't require is for the bus to enter the application site tonight, but it would definitely, or we'd seek it to come off Cherry Orchard Way and through the business park.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. The small underpass that you showed us, I understand that used to be a railway, a light railway for the brickfields. Is there any plans to maintain that? Or the heritage of it at least?
On the site.
Yeah.
No.
The underpass access that was in the photograph, yes. So there is a document produced jointly by South End Borough Council, Essex County Council signed up to that as well, and Rochford, that looks at the cycleway and pedestrian access ways all around this area and linking to Rochford Town Centre as well. And there's ambitions for upgrade and new public footpaths around there. opening up the underpass access is part of that proposal. And as part of this application, this outline permission, we secured some Section 106 financial contribution. Again, tonight, proportionately, we're asking for another contribution to that. So there is a pot of money available. And I spoke to my colleagues in planning policy. They're undertaking some work at the moment looking at feasibility and who is going to take that forward and looking at opening up of that underpass. But there's no firm dates for exactly when works are going to happen, and I don't have any sort of plans to show you exactly what that entails at the moment.
Thank you. That's all Quay.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one question about Health and Safety Executive raised an issue about the site's former use and about some aspects of its former use that may have a negative impact on the development. Have all of those issues been dealt with and resolved?
This site, because it had a historic consent to store a certain type of gas, required consultation with the Health and Safety Executive. But that consent effectively has ceased because the brickwork site is no longer operational. But because it hasn't technically been rescinded, that hazardous substance consent, the Health and Safety Executive have required us to put on a condition, as it is at the end of the report, that means that they couldn't actually build out and then occupy certain units before that consent had actually been rescinded. It's the council, Rochford Council, is job to go through that process of rescinding that consent. So we are in the process of trying to ensure that that takes place. And once that's done, it will be all finalised. But there is that condition to protect things in the meantime, on the basis that because the consent still technically exists, there is still technically the possibility of somebody coming to the site and storing that material, even though it's very unlikely that that would ever happen now. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. Will that have any impact on how quickly the site comes forward and will be developed?
We hope not, because this outline consent is only the first element of the consent. So the applicant, if they got outline planning permission tonight, would still have to go through a process of submitting reserved matters applications. And we are in the process, I with my colleagues in legal have already sort of started that process of making sure that that hazardous substance consent no longer exists at the site. So we are hopeful that it wouldn't hold things up for the developer, and that's why we've sort of started the ball rolling.
Okay, thank you. Members, we have a recommendation starting on 6.33 going through to 6.44, which I'm happy to move from the chair, with your agreement also adding an informative about the parking provision at least being equal to that in the other half of the site. Those members in favour of that, please indicate. Any against? No, that's everyone. That's carried. Thank you. Item 7, 19 South Street, Rochford, change of use to flats. I'm just taking this one. Mr. Evans. This is one where there is some additional information on the addendum. Didn't stop at all for any of it.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. So the application is in respect of a change of use from the current office use to a C3 use, comprising in number 8 flats, which are comprising 7 two-person, 1-bedroom flats and 1 3-person, 2-bedroomed flat. So the location, I think we're all familiar with the site. It's located to the east of South Street in the Rochford Conservation Area. Move on to slide 2, please. So there's a site layout plan here. What we've got. So this is the existing site layout. So basically what the plan shows is, as the report indicates, there are currently 10 car parking spaces within the rear courtyard area serving the site. The site area does extend to an area of garden at the rear. So this area will be retained basically, and the report also indicates that the current parking provision is a 2.4 by 4.8 metre parking space, which doesn't comply with the current standards. However, it's a change of use, and therefore the justification placed forward by the applicant is that in terms of intensification of use, as that isn't the case, that the current parking is actually sort of adequate. If we move on to the next slide, please. And what that slide shows is there is a slight alteration to the parking provision, in that an area at the rear of the site will be extended slightly to create a turning area here, with the existing paved area being increased by approximately just over a metre, just to provide a little bit more space. But basically that's the site layout. So it is as per existing, but there's a notional red line here which earmarks an area of amenity space that can be used in connection with the proposed use. Let's move forward if we can. Thank you. That's okay. I think there's some photos I'd like to show if possible. We'll just run through a few photographs that'll all make sense. So obviously that's the frontage, very nice 3-storey building, brick building, simple architecture of its period, looking across from South Street. I'd like to show the access next if possible, please. Yeah, there we go. So that's the site access, which is a narrow access. It's a gated access. We have the next slide shows the actual gate that's in place. That's a view up the street. So that is the current gated entrance. Because of the listing, there's no intention to change that arrangement. It's very much fixed by the fabric of the building. And I'd just like to show a few photographs as we progress through the site. So the building on the left is like the outhouse. This outhouse on the plan is going to be used for cycle storage, for refuse storage, and also general storage. So I think what the scheme demonstrates actually is the sort of effective use of buildings without having to add anything to provide the basic provisions to support the residential use. If you can move forward again, please. There we go. So that is a view up the car park, looking up towards the rear garden area. So it's a very much established bricked paving area. And as the report says, in terms of the drainage on site, that will remain unchanged. It's a permeable surface. If you move on, thank you. There we go. So that is the alternative view, looking down the actual courtyard arrangement, down towards the rear of the building. Members will note from the report that in terms of the alterations to the building, this application really tests the principle of the change of use and whether there are any issues in association with that change of use that are objectionable, whereby the concurrent application for the listed building consent deals more with the alterations or the physical effect of the works on the interest of the building. However, as it's listed, the listing element is also an overriding material consideration within the planning application, and therefore hence why there's a duplication on the detail provided in the reports that reciprocate one another. But that's in accordance with guidance that we have to apply. But what I'd like to just show and refer to within this photograph is the rear porch area. That's very much a modern addition. In connection with this development, that rear porch area will be taken away in order to provide more light to the rear of the building. Very much a modern addition, and it's not a particularly desirable element of the scheme. If we move on, thank you. And that's just another view of the site. So what we have is we've got the main house, and also we've got a 2-storey. We've got the 3-storey element at the front, and then we've got this 2-storey element filtering down to a 1-storey element, which is this building here. So these will all be flats, and I'd just like to run you through the floor space and for the flats. There we go. So the ground floor plan, what we have effectively here is flat one here. So flat 1 is a 38 square metre flat. Flat 2, they're all sort of double-bedded bedrooms effectively. Flat 2 is a 40.4 square metre flat. Flat 3, which is in the two-storey element here, is a 41.9 square metre duplex arrangement. And flat 4 here is 77.2 metres squared. And we just move on quickly to the first floor arrangement. First floor, flat 5. Sorry. Flat 5, there we go, on the first floor. I think that's flat 5, isn't it? Flat 5 is a 39.5 square metre and will be a 2-bedroomed unit. And flat 6, so it isn't great. Flat 6 is a 46.1 square metre. Then we move on to the second floor, which is flat 7. Similar arrangement here. It's okay. Flat 7, which is the third floor room, is a 40.1 square metre. And flat 8 is a 48.1 square metres. So the issues, really, we'll move on to that. Essentially, this application, as I've alluded to, tests and assesses the principle of the use and its acceptability, whereas the concurrent listed building consent application considers the impact of the use on the fabric of the building. So just to sort of conclude on those key considerations. In terms of the principle of the use, what the report actually highlights is that policy H1 of the core strategy indicates an appropriate level of residential intensification within town centres and also concentrates on the efficient use of land, and that is aligned with the key principles of the National Planning Policy Framework in terms of reducing development pressure for residential use in Greenbelt. So the application highlights where the actual proposal meets with those policies. Interestingly then, also within the report, the actual use itself would be akin to a 30 units per hectare density, which is considered to be efficient use of land. I think what the report actually sort of tries to sort of focus upon is that there is no presumption against the use. Members will note the comments received from the Economic Development Department in terms of the requirement for space within Rochford Town Centre to promote up-and-coming businesses, and that was taken into account. However, there is no policy which would override the presumption in favour of sustainable development, to which the authority considers that this scheme is. It's a sustainable town centre location, reusing a heritage asset in doing so in an appropriate manner. The impact of the use, members will note the actual gated entrance. There is no change to that entrance in any way. There is no objection from the Highway Authority, and there's no intensification of use. The parking, members will note from the report, point 6.57, there's a 91% provision of the parking provision aligned with the current standards. Now, it's short, basically, of one visitor space. So 7 flats require 1 parking space. The 2-bed flat requires 2 parking spaces. And there's also a requirement of 0.5 parking spaces per flat. So there's a shortfall, actually, in real terms of 1 parking space, which is a visitor parking space, which is the 0.25 multiplied by 4 to make the 1 parking space. So the argument and the case put forward within the application is it's a sustainable town centre location where policy does indicate that there is an allowance given the sustainability of a site. There is an acceptance of a lowered standard, providing there are good accesses to services, and that's the basis on which the authority considered the application. Just to close, in terms of trees, on the site plan, a couple of trees, T1 and T2, will be removed to create the additional turning area at the top of the site. Members will note from the addendum that we have now received a response from the arboricultural advisor who has no issue in relation to the application. They are trees of no significant importance. Bats, the site, there's no evidence of breeding bats on site. However, members will note from the conditions that there are conditions, I think it's 11 and 12, in terms of safeguarding bats, one including a lighting scheme. The amenity space is provided within the rear area, so there's a requirement for amenity space of 25 square metres per flat. Also, members will note from the report that the application cites the availability of further amenity space granted across the road near the lake. And just to conclude then, just to lead us back to the revised recommendation, members will note from the addendum that a couple of corrections, if you like, have to be made. The one was in relation to the scheme not being able to comply with the parking standards, so as an oversight on my part in terms of applying the modern standards. So that's been amended in condition 4. And condition 5, in terms of the gates, it's suggested now, Chair, that the gates will be maintained in an open position, so the current status quo is maintained. Just to conclude then, in terms of the parking provision, highways have got no issue. And in terms of the shortfall of 1 parking space commensurate with the current standards, I think what my report actually concludes is that that in itself does not amount to a reason to refuse the application, in that there will be demonstrable harm to highway safety and on-highway parking as a result of that shortfall. Therefore, Chair, it's my recommendation, given the revised recommendation, that approval be granted.
Thank you. Councillor Lucas-Gill, do you want to say anything before we get started on this one?
No further comment.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Steptoe.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've got a little bit of concern about the entrance. Is it possible to have the photograph back up again of the entrance from the roadside? Don't worry if you can't.
Go on. Might take a while. Do you want to start talking?
Okay, basically what I'm a little bit concerned about is if those gates are closed and people are trying to get into this site, it could mean a vehicle has to stop covering the footpath to get into the site. So I'd like to perhaps see if the gates are going to be closed.
They're not. Condition 5.
But if there is the opportunity
secured
for that
in
to
an
happen,
open position and maintained as such in perpetuity.
Yeah.
That's fairly
Okay,
comprehensive. Sorry.
And the other concern I had was with regards to the people exiting from the site. As you're coming out of the site, you have to come across the part of the footpath to be able to see if anybody's walking along. Is it possible to have some sort of mirror perhaps there, so you can just get a glance of people coming down the footpath?
Okay. Councillor Weston, do you want to?
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, so, Officer, did you mention I noticed on a couple of those photographs of the trees and the foliage up there, it's obviously because it's summer at the moment, they're quite extended. Are the trees being either cut back or being taken away? If they're just being cut back, whose responsibility is it afterwards to look after the trees and the foliage there, please? Thank you.
Councillor Gooding.
Julie, did you indicate? No,
Oh,
she didn't.
I didn't. False information. Councillor Hockway then.
Thank you, Chairman. I understand currently that at the back of the property, it's all open access all the way back behind the council offices as well. Is there any intention to have that secured off so that the site is contained, or will that still be open access to for those people who are resident in the flats to access areas behind the council offices?
And thank you. And I'll just add one. Given the sensitivity of the site, the potential narrowness of the pavement, there'll clearly be a management company that looks after bits and pieces there, probably including the trees that Councillor Weston mentioned. But in the past, we've known management companies come and go. in this particular location, even things like putting the bins out need to have a degree of control because the street is narrow, it's on a prominent location, it's a heritage building in itself, it's next to a very important heritage building. So I wonder if you could say something about the strength or the way in which the management, we can have confidence in the management company and the way it will work. Thank you. Oh, sorry, we'll just gather it all together. Councillor Cannell.
Chairman, first of all, apologies, I should have also declared an interest at the start as a member of the investment board going into this year. Hope that can be noted and I could still speak. Just concerns about the amendment to the access, about the gate being open all the time. Is there any mitigations against parking abuse in those scenarios, especially if the residents are required to pay for those spaces as part of their rent?
I've noted 5 main issues that have emerged. One question was about the mirror and the access. Now, in terms of the acceptability of the access, so at a point set back 2.4 from the edge of the carriageway, one would have to look at the visibility in each direction, and we've got, I think, the previous photographs will show the actual visibility from the access. So that's the one. That's the visibility looking down South Street. So in terms of a mirror, we're familiar actually with the issues of mirrors. I think the general feeling about mirrors are that if you have to install a mirror opposite an access, that is almost tantamount to saying that or acknowledging that the access is substandard, but mirrors don't always seem to work really. So in terms of addressing that issue, the highway response really does set the bar in terms of what is acceptable. So given that there's no intensification of use per se in terms of in relation to the office use, so if there was an intensification of use, there was more cars, that would then raise the issue about the adequacy of the visibility and the setback visibility. But because there's no intensification of use, that consideration as a material consideration doesn't really come into play. That would be my opinion. So although I appreciate what you're indicating might be the use for the mirror, mirrors are basically tantamount to accepting an unacceptable situation in the first place. So we have to take on board what highways are saying, and it has got no objection, but it does lead us on to the issue about the gates. Hence, in terms of human nature, what the councillor is mentioning here, in terms of it will be open, it has to remain open, because obviously if the gates were closed, there's an issue then with piling back onto the road, etc., and that would be a dangerous situation. So in terms of those gates remaining open, with a condition as suggested in the amended condition 5, that to be retained in an open position at all times, it retains the current status quo effectively. There was the other issue about the landscaping. There's a condition on landscaping. So in terms of, I'd perhaps like to refer the issue of the development management company over. But in terms of the landscaping, there's a condition there on the landscaping. So in terms of the trees, the councillor asked about what's going to be trimmed back. So there are 2 trees going to be trimmed back in the area where there's going to be an additional turning area at the top of the site. So, but there's no other sort of trimming back effectively. There's going to be more enhancements within that rear garden area. There was an issue raised in terms of the access and the open access through the site, through the courtyard. So indeed, one could walk from the gated entrance through the courtyard area to the rear garden area and also through to Millview Court. And it's acknowledged that there is open access, although the residents of Millview Court use the site and utilise the site. What we have to remember is if we could perhaps refer right back to the site layout plan edged in red. What we have to remember is the extent of this planning unit actually only extends to about 1/3 of the total land area of the rear garden. So in terms of how the rear garden area in its entirety is used by people at Millview Court, that will be remain unaffected. So to address the question, there'll be no sort of physical barriers per se erected within that rear garden area. It's just a notional red line that shows the provision of the 25 square metres per flat ratio in the rear garden area. So there's one more question I understand, which was that in terms of a development management company. Could I perhaps refer that over to yourself, because I'm not aware of the arrangements?
Thank you, Chairman. Just briefly, members will see that normally when we have the bigger schemes, the sort of hundreds of houses, there's quite often a lot of open space area that isn't publicly adopted. So the management schemes that you normally see negotiated through a 106 are for the upkeep of those places, which I think these days the residents collectively pay into. I'm not aware of any of those who actually manage the site by taking bins out. The best comparison I have is your development similar to this that we did at Acacia House in East Street. I think there was 6 or 9 flats, something like that there. And there is a similar, at the rear of the building, there is a building with the bins in it. Those, I think, are either collected by the operatives or that the householders put them out like all other householders do. I think for the purposes of the bin collection, Chairman, it's a matter of scale. If you've got a very big scheme, then there may be some management, but the management schemes that we normally discuss at this committee really cover the large areas of open space that require upkeep.
Councillor Weston.
Coming back to you on the bins, where if the residents put their bins out, where exactly are they going to put them? On the highway, on the path, out in the front where the Rochford is, or?
Chairman, in the Acacia House, I think they stay in the shed and the operatives collect them, but the bin store here, I don't know if Arwell can show it on, just show it on that, use the laser, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. They're not that far from the collection point, so the freighter pulls up for a few minutes, gets the bins emptied, and then after a few seconds is moving away. There's not too much of a delay, yes, a few seconds or so while they open and shut them and put them back, but they normally allow for it. Some of the operatives, they have bigger bins, so instead of emptying lots of multitude bins, they have, say, one for recycling, one for non-recyclings, etc. So they 2 of them push out a big bin, and then that's it. That's the job done. It doesn't, I'll say, in Acacia House where there's a real bottleneck, it doesn't cause a problem.
That's the whole way.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just going back to just following up on the question that I raised before. Just for clarity, you say that the rear green space behind the council offices are already open to the public. So is that whole area open to public use? Is there actual right of public access to the rear area, or is it just for residents of the other property that you mentioned?
Right, just to clarify that, so although I said that physically one would be able to walk from South Street through the site, I think it's fair to say that by virtue of the period of use of this rear garden area by the people at Millview Court, they've assumed a right to use it, and in previous representations on a previous application, a views have been expressed that it's their garden, but the applicant has actually confirmed that there's no actual legal right for them to use any of that space, but they've assumed that right to use it. So it's not actually public open space, it's just space that is associated with the rear of 19 South Street. Formerly in a bygone era was agricultural land at some point, which became part of a curtilage, which by now, by virtuous use, is seen as something that is available for the use of people of Millview Court, but no, they have no legal right to use it.
Okay. Councillor Cannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A follow-up on the parking abuse question. I'm not sure I necessarily agree that there's no change. I think my understanding is that it's only open at the moment during business hours, and we're now proposing it open 24/7. And also those bays aren't allocated to certain people's use, whereas I believe that would now be the case in these proposals. So I think that I would then ask the question again, should we mitigate, are there any plans to mitigate against parking abuse in this area?
I think the answer's no to that one, effectively. Members, we've had a discussion on this. We've got a recommendation printed on page 7.36 through to 7.39 with two revised recommendations around point 4 and point 5. Those members in favour of this proposal, please indicate. Those against? Thank you. That item is carried. Item 8, we cover similar ground, but out of necessity, 19 South Street, Rochford.
Thank you. Right, so this is a concurrent application, and it basically, as the report indicated, deals solely with those issues in terms of how the works or the use affects the fabric of the building. So just to start off briefly with the statutes, the main statutes that govern the consideration of this application is the Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act and the National Planning Policy Framework Chapter 12, Conserving and Enhancing the Historic Environment. The report in section 2.2 cites the alterations. Essentially, what the report indicates is that during the 1980s, substantial works were undertaken to this building, which entails that there is very little, if any, of the original fabric left internally. However, the external shell, with the exception of heavy windows, which are replacements, the only original fabric of the building probably is the actual outer brick skin itself and the internal sort of masonry. Other than that, the house has experienced extensive renovations. I'll just sort of refer to a few things on here. The actual works themselves, I'll just indicate very briefly what they are. So there's works, obviously, that will be required to make this building fit for purpose for residential use, mainly complying with building regulations. There'll be elements that will be repaired and enhanced, and as I've mentioned, the rear porch will be removed. So internally, the building is devoid of any original features. That's indicated in section 2.2 of the report. Section 2.3 cites how in the 1980s, interior walls, floors, ceilings and joinery almost completely replaced, leaving very little of the original fabric. So in summary, what are the works proposed then in connection with the use, which is those works that this application has to consider? There's going to be acoustic insulation, new partition walls and openings, but reusing many of the existing openings. Windows and external doors will be refurbished. Replacement doors and windows procured to match the existing styles with slim double glazing. Reslating of the outbuilding. Ceiling joists on upper floors raised to allow for higher headroom. Floor joists which are non-original strengthened and replaced. So it's pretty much basically an internal refit, really. Externally, I think it's important in terms of listed buildings. Section 2.8 of the report says only flues and bathroom vents will penetrate the external walls kept to the east and north elevation, because obviously because of the type of use, there'll be obviously tumble dryers, washing machines, bathrooms, WCs operating on a 24-hour basis. So there is going to be moisture in the building, so that does need to have an outlet basically for that. So if we just move on quickly then, in terms of the key provision within the actual statutes themselves is the legislation in section 66 and 72 of the 1990 Act. And it's basically the requirement on local planning authorities not to as such preserve buildings, but to take special interest to account in the event of change of uses. And the report in section 6.50 actually indicates that it's a positive impact, because the background to the various legislation is that it recognises that buildings have to adapt, they have to change, given a certain use, because sometimes buildings will fall into disrepair. So therefore, buildings have to be able to be adaptable where possible. And I think that where this application, there isn't any issue from a listed buildings point of view, is because the building has experienced so much extensive renovation in the 1980s, there is very little of the fabric left. I'm not sure whether you can show that internal. No, I did have a couple of internal photographs, but what the photographs would show us is in the, I'm unable to bring the photograph up, I apologise, but in the downstairs corridor, what one will see when they look into 19 South Street is you've got modern lighting, you've got the fire alarms, you've got Artex ceilings. One would not be able to, other than the stairs itself, which is a relatively ordinary stairs leading up from the front door, there is nothing about the building that would tell you internally that it's of any historic interest whatsoever. No exposed beams, no sort of nooks and crannies. So in terms of the actual legislation and preserving and taking into account the special interest of the building, other than potential works in terms of flues and vents, which I believe is conditioned in accordance with the Essex Place Services Historic Buildings advice. They're satisfied that the works are acceptable, and there are conditions in condition 3 of the proposed approval for listed building consent, which provides some safeguards in approving details, such as the 1 in 20 scale sections of windows. So I think in terms of achieving a sash type window, what the authority would not want to approve in the light of the legislation is windows that would be inappropriate for that shell of a building. So slimline, highly efficient windows that are in keeping with the general architecture of the building. Therefore, Chair, members, it is my recommendation that listed building consent be approved as a separate approval from the planning application. Thank you.
Anyone have any issues on this one to raise? Okay, members, we have a recommendation printed on 8.17 going through to 8.18. Those members in favour of the approval, please indicate. Thank you. That's unanimously approved. I'll just get Councillor Ioana back.
Did you read the evacuation?
Yeah.
What's this then?
It's on tape.
Just wondered. I just wondered. Chair.
Just waiting for Councillor Ioana to get back. There we go. So, item 9, 32 Park Gardens, Hawkwell, proposed rear extension. This isn't normally one that would come to us, but there's a potential conflict of interest, so it's proper that we see it in front of committee. Mr. Strang.
Thank you, Chairman. This application, as the Chairman said, is the applicant is related to a member of the staff, and it's this chalet that you see on the southern side of Park Gardens amidst several other chalets that are on this side. Typically, Park Gardens has got a number of pitched roof front dormers, very much in vogue with your guidance. Modest dormer cheeks, modest good scale, attractive dormer styles. There are a few flat roof ones, but even those are modest in scale. If we can go to the existing plan, please, Katie. The existing building has those dormers, like I just described. You'll see again, look, modest pitched roof styles. There's some development at the back, which doesn't primarily concern us tonight. And best way of looking at this application is if you look at the roof plans, you'll see the 2 dormers, the central ridgeline across, another smaller dormer at the back, and a small flat roof inconspicuous dormers at the back. If we can see the proposed plan 3, please, Chairman. Sorry, Katie. The proposal is to link those 2 pitched roof front dormers. rather contrary to, if this application had came in, you'd try and encourage them to do what they had, is the simplest way of looking at it. And you'll see that they then link up over the roof ridge into the dormer at the back. There isn't an appreciable increase in height. It's roughly equal to the ridge, but just slightly above it. Best seen on the roof plan again that we saw earlier on. Instead of isolated pockets of dormer forms in the roof, we see this large, bulky, flat-roofed addition basically detracting from that character. And given the presence of other dormers in the street, it really, officers feel it lacks the scale and character and sympathy that your policies and guidance would normally follow. So the recommendation, Chairman, is refusal for this one for the reason that's set out in the report.
Thank you, Councillor Gooding.
As Ward Councillor Chair, I would
Okay. Do it. Microphone. Oh. Yeah, I think. Heard you anyway.
I said, as Ward Councillor, I declare non-pecuniary interest.
Councillor Weston then.
Yes, excuse me, officer. Is this two properties or one property? And can I look at a photo of the street of the properties? Have you got one up there, please?
We don't have that picture.
Chairman, we don't have photographs of this one or an aerial view, but to answer the question, you'll see the usual style with these. They draw a dotted line down that side. It's a semi-detached property, and so what you see on the drawing is the one unit, as you would say. It's one half of a semi-detached pair.
Okay, thank you. Right, members, then there's a recommendation for refusal printed on page 9.4. Those members in favour of the refusal, please indicate. Those against? That item is refused. Thank you. Item number 10, application referred from the weekly list, land adjacent to St Teresa, Pudsey Hall Lane, Canewdon. Who's taking this one?
Thank you, Chairman. This application is located on the eastern side of Pudsey Hall Lane, Pudsey Hall Farm further off the drawing there to the north. You'll see that the site is edged red. It's a smaller part of the actual ownership of the applicant. The remaining land in blue demonstrates that the applicant has control over that land, but it's not part of the application before you. And whilst we're on this plan, there is a couple as a sort of a mobile home and a touring caravan on there. They've been on there a number of years. Those two caravans there are not part of the application that you're going to be considering tonight. The site is in the Green Belt and within the Coastal Protection Belt, and this application is part retrospective for a traveller site. The application relates to the front, as I've explained, and if we can see the site plan, please. The proposal, as I say, the area red, now in better detail, you'll see is this sort of rectangular shape to the front with the access onto Pudsey Hall Lane. The application is part retrospective. Boundary fencing has been put up to about a height of 6 foot, 2 metres, 1.8 metres or so, with gates to the front. Large part of this area all hard surfaced in chip-ins and hardcore, for which there's an enforcement notice being served, and then a gated access to the land at the back, which we understand from the applicant he intends to, if successful, have for grazing. What is on the site at present is a mobile home across this way and up here, and what this equates to in traveller site terms, Chairman, is one pitch. Two pitches. A pitch comprises a mobile home, a static permanent base, and one touring caravan that is either hitched to a truck and goes on touring, or some of the self-drive motorhome type structures. This application is including a day room, but on site at present that day room has not been constructed. The applicants have found a cesspool on the site, which we saw at the beginning of the week they have connected to. And a cesspool is, if you like, it's a tank in the ground. There's no biodegrading. It's like a box, if you like, and when it's full, it follows to be emptied. If we could see one of the photos, if there's a chance, please, the one facing into the site, 3. Hopefully this will show members what the appearance of the site as I've just described. No, Joy? Yeah, if you can open that, yeah. Just bear with me. There you go, Chairman. This side is the northern side toward Pudsey Farm. That is the entrance onto Pudsey Hall Lane, and you'll see the surface that's been put down. And this is what we would call a static or mobile home type, more permanent base. They're all mobile, but these tend to be more fixed to the ground and have slightly more permanence. The tourer that I referred to there, that's parked on that side there, that is more easily transported. If we could go back to the site plan, please. An enforcement notice was served. This application was retrospective, and when those works were underway, now with the applicant submitting a plan for you to consider tonight, that enforcement notice has time to take effect until the 27th of July to allow members to make a decision tonight, and then that has, depending which way members go, there is then a further 3-month period for compliance. Now, in terms of the overall analysis, the development proposed, whether temporary or permanent, is inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. Government policy and the advice from government on travellers and gypsy sites is clear. The subject to the best interest of any children on the site, personal circumstances and unmet need are usually unlikely to outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt. Again, clear advice and a clear position. The National Planning Policy for Traveller Sites requires that when making decisions, account needs to be taken of the criteria listed for you in paragraph 20, A to E, and I draw members' attention to which the level of local provision and the availability and lack of alternative accommodation for the applicants is one of the criteria, together with the Part E, which says there doesn't need to be a local connection of the applicant to the area. Members may appreciate the previous advice, I think from 2006, required applicants to demonstrate some connectivity to the local area. The current policy does not require that. I had hoped to show members the allocation, but if that's not great, if you can please. The members will be aware that there is a site allocation in your allocations document at Michelin's Farm. Now, that has been adopted since 2014, and we don't have a planning approval. The site has not been developed and laid out ready, and there are a number of difficulties with developing that site. It's part of a wider application alongside some industrial and commercial development, but it would meet the current requirement for 15 pitches, which is changing in the emerging advice to 19 pitches. Here we see it. It's part of a wider allocation for commercial development, and this site here is the hectare or so for the allocation that you have. Now, there are a number of problems with that. The site is generally been subject to contamination, an action that the council has taken in the past. There has been ownership changes which haven't helped bringing the site forward, and there is also difficulties and constraints with the railway line bridge here. The Highway Authority, when looking at this, when you leave this site, you need to accelerate away, particularly if you're towing, say, caravans or you're using HGV vehicles. You need a certain amount of ability to merge into the flowing traffic. Now, that is constrained here by the railway bridge that goes over the what is now the A1245. So there are difficulties in achieving the allocation that we have. Now, whilst it's clear from national policy that a failing like this should not normally outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt, the difficulty we have with this site is that the council's land that it would use to meet this allocation is all in the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt boundary is very tightly drawn to the existing settlement, which means future allocations and provision largely are going to be met from a Greenbelt allocation somewhere. And this is what has been tested by 2 planning inspectors, one on a site in Watery Lane, which was slightly different to this in that it involved some previously developed land on a former pumping station, but still in the Greenbelt, and that application was retrospective like this. It didn't have planning permission first. Members considered that application alongside some enforcement action. Permission was refused. An appeal inspector granted approval, a permanent permission for gypsy sites. It wasn't personal. She made the decision in November 2017. And then more recently, we've had a grant of permission for a non-retrospective site. An applicant put in a case opposite the Rayleigh Club in Holbridge Road, joining a house called Woodville. Some members may remember it was also a site proposed some time ago for Peaceful Place for dementia respite care. And the applicant there had not, unlike this applicant, had not done anything retrospectively. They put in a planning application. We refused it because of the national policy and the fact that it was green belt. And in February this year, 2018, an inspector granted permission, this time on a 5-year basis, and made it personal to the applicants who proposed. So you've got two slightly different decisions, but what they have in common is that both inspectors reasoned that as a vast majority of the district is designated green belt, with the exception of Foulness Island, which is separately controlled and not easily accessible to the travelling community to find sites, that therefore future allocations and gypsy site provision is going to be met from what is currently green belt somewhere. And that presumption rather undermines the stance in the national policy that that gypsy and traveller sites should not in preference be located on green belt. They should be allocated elsewhere. In Rochford's case, other than what is already developed and anything that may come forward by way of previously developed land, then future allocations will be met from the green belt. Now, in the earlier decision for Watery Lane, the inspector was critical that no provision was being released through the development plan. Reasons I've explained to you earlier, how the allocation so far hasn't been successful. And therefore, provision would likely happen through ad hoc planning permissions, like this one that we have here, planning applications like this, and the one that was then before her. And that the council could not demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable sites or longer-term sites over 6 to 10 years in broad locations. In the Holbridge Road decision, the inspector noted that some 17 pitches are currently unauthorised in the district, which reflects the demand that is between the sort of the 15 pitches under the current allocation and 19 by 2033 in the emerging gypsy and traveller assessment that you have. The inspector gave significant weight to the absence of the 5-year supply and a failure of local policy and unmet need, and a failing to meet that need in future. Now, this is perhaps particularly pertinent. That inspector was struck by the contrast in success between the allocations for the settled community that are bringing sites forward, like you've seen in Hall Road, applications in outline on Holbridge, development in detail in Wakegreen, etc., and the contrast to the lack of provision and the effectiveness of the allocation we have at Michelin's Farm for the traveller site. The findings of both inspectors are material to the current application you have. The circumstances around this application before you tonight are very similar, and if you like, it's been rehearsed not once but twice by 2 previous inspectors in the last sort of 12 months or so. The circumstances around that provision of deliverability have not changed in officers' view. There hasn't been a grant of perhaps an outline permission on a site somewhere to release a site and the likelihood of that coming forward, and therefore that situation with the inspector's decision is what has framed the recommendation from officers for a 5-year period. Now you'll see on the addendum, Chairman, that there are comments from Canewdon Parish Council, and I trust that members have read those and I don't need to go over those. So the recommendation, Chairman, is for approval for a period of 5 years and personal to the applicants, largely based on the Holbridge Road application, and for the other conditions, as you'll see, set out in your report.
Thank you. We've got Mr. Thomas who's going to speak on this one. Five minutes, I'll let you know when you've got a minute to go.
Right. My name is Mr. Thomas, Mr. Stan Thomas, to make certain there's no doubt about. There is another Thomas in the council, nothing to do with me. I have lived at St. Teresa Pudsey Hall Lane for over 40 years. It is my last property in the last property in the lane before the Fewing Farm and closest to the application site. The area has changed little over the last years and is open, quiet and peaceful. I am opposed to the planning application because the introduction of hard surface and 5 structures into a previously open area will seriously harm the green belt. For personal experience, I'm aware that the harm to the Greenbelt is treated very important issue by the Council and the Planning Inspectorate. Development is only allowed in Greenbelt under exceptional circumstances. Can this be exceptional? Recently, I was applied for a single bungalow for my severely disabled daughter on land I own, which is adjacent to the site in question. Notwithstanding the fact the shortage of special housing for disabled people, my application was refused. Our circumstances could not be considered as exceptional. If you could see how my daughter walks, you would understand what exceptional could possibly be, possibly approaching death. The National Planning Policy Framework requires local authorities to plan for a mixed housing, including for people with disabilities. Lack of provision in Rochford did not stop my application being turned down. I understand the local authority is also required to provide travellers' pitches. Rochford District has not done this, and so has once failed again to provide the specific type of accommodation. However, it seems to be the case in this application that there are no ditches, no pitches available. That means permission could be granted. From my point of view, that seems to be very unfair. Not only does it appear unfair, my application for a single bungalow would have been far less impact on the Greenbelt than a huge hard surface and 5 structures. The officer's report on the application states that, paragraph 23, it is considered that the development would clearly have an adverse effect on the Greenbelt openness, and that clearly constitutes an encroachment on the countryside. I've produced an aerial photograph showing the site existing and the site proposed. This shows how truly and above the statements are. It demonstrates that once a total Greenbelt was becoming something akin to an industrial estate. This must surely be considered by anybody to be unacceptable in this particular location. The planning officer then goes on to justify his recommendations of approval of the application by citing 2 recent sites where the travellers' pitches were allowed in Greenbelt. I have read both these decisions, and none of them differ in many ways. I've read both these decisions and note that they differ in many ways from the situation in Pudsey Hall Lane. I feel that they set a precedent to justify this approval. Firstly, both applications relate to sites that are considered to be suitable for by planning inspectors. Watery Lane site is within a walking distance of Holbridge and its many facilities. Holbridge Road is on a bus route, and the inspector described it as accessible to services. Pudsey Hall Lane is remote and not accessible by bus, and is unaccepted in an unadopted road that is unsuitable for increased traffic. Secondly, both sites have boundaries which are already well screened by mature trees. This makes them far less visible by the public view. The application of the site in nature is in nature open. The application is open in nature, and planning to undertake trees to take establishment.
Just a minute to go.
The policy of this policy H for planning travellers sites say that the council should be strictly limited to travellers in sites open and country that can be away from existing settlements. The appeal appears to be referred to the company policy. The application does not. I also note that the decisions and conditions in which to prevent commercial activities taking place on the site, including the storage of materials, parking of vehicles over 3.5 tonnes, and reservation and external lighting. Why are no such conditions attached to this recommendation of approval? I fear that the commission should be granted. I fear that should this permission be granted, the whole of the site will be used in an intensive fashion, leading to complete disruption of peace and tranquility of the area. The council has clear grounds upon which to refuse this application. It does not in practice compare with either of the planning sites. If this planning approval, the council is sending a clear message that all travellers and illegal occupation of Greenbelt land is carried out in proportion become acceptable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How did I do?
10 seconds leeway I gave you.
Right.
Right. Do you wish to say anything, Councillor Lucas-Gill? Okay. Councillor Arno.
Better put my glass on. Chairman, firstly I'd like to thank the officer, Mike Stranks, for a constructive argument for regards to RDC's position, and also Mr Thomas's concerns on Pugsley Hall Lane. This report, I had to think about it for a few days, and also listening to the speaker and the officer before the committee, is a marginal case, and in terms of very special circumstances. I find this very worrying recommendation, and seem to be largely based on the fact that Rochford District Council does not have a 5-year supply of traveller pitches, which makes it likely that any appeal against a refusal of planning permission is likely to succeed. Saying that, this is really unacceptable and should be addressed as a matter of urgency as part of our debate this evening, before any appeals are lost by Rochford District Council. My view is that the site should be identified through the local plan process and not in ad hoc way as it is currently happening. Having reviewed the report and the concerns of the residents and the parish council, as a ward member, I consider that the development is unsuitable to the green belt and coastal protection belt and special landscape area. I think, for my opinion, clarification is required from the Environmental Authority on how to deal with the human and other waste on site in the interest of health and safety. I fully support the comments by the residents who have submitted their objections in this report. A few of them, like starting the development prior to making the application, the damage to trees and shrubs and hedges, lack of action by RDC to defend the greenbelt, and inappropriate greenbelt development, and outkeeping with development in the area, and out of character with local area character. This is only a few, and I could rattle on a few more, which will take me hours on end. I don't think you would want me to do that this evening, because I'd rather get on with the debate. Saying that, our development plan has been found to be sound, fit for purpose, and has allocated the site as not only greenbelt, but a landscape improvement area. But as an aside, this site has had these allocations as mentioned in reports, namely the 1838, the 1718 and the 17180. That's all I've got to say at this stage, because I would like to be involved in the debate and ask the chairman to come back as a summary after the debate.
Okay. Councillor Weston.
Thank you, Chairman. I noticed on page 1019, and you have said that it's only temporary permission for 5 years, and if and when the dependents or the children leave the site, then everything has to come off the site. My question is, if after 5 years, if this is approved, and if after 5 years the applicants do not come from the site, does that mean to say that we are going to have to do another enforcement notice? And the other thing is, how are we going to monitor that no more than two, one static, one mobile home is going to be on the site itself? And can I have a photograph, if you've got one, of the area of the? You haven't got one. Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Chairman, because this is a retrospective application, and maybe I confused matters in my presentation, but it's only partly implemented at the moment. So when I laboured, there was 2 statics and 1 tourer. and we was able to see photographs of that. This application before you is for what you see on the plan. So it would be two statics, the more permanent mobile homes. They're not permanent in law because it takes, say, 24 hours and they can be towed away. But the larger, more fixed to the ground, they have jacks and ramps, they have perhaps gas connected for heating, etc. They're distinct from the touring caravans, which can have similar connections, like the caravan club. You know, you tow it, you have your water and things connected. But the idea is that the gypsies travel. They have a settled base, which is taken by the statics, and then they use the tourers for going off touring. So what is proposed before you tonight is effectively two pitches. A pitch qualifies as a mobile home with a tourer, and what you have here is two mobile homes and two tourers, but they would share a day room. So if you granted planning permission, this is the development that would have permission. It's only partly implemented on sites at the moment because the applicant has stopped works as a result of work by our council's enforcement team. And the extent of hard standing was stopped because there was a stop notice served. But we had to be mindful in the way we manage that, and the government would expect us to be reasonable and measured in our approach, that having stopped somebody, albeit that it was unauthorised, that we be reasonable in a period of compliance. So we've give them an opportunity in the way that the enforcement notice is structured for this application to be considered by you tonight, and then depending on your decision things will cascade. Now, to answer the question, it's pretty easy to monitor the site as to how many are there. There's probably nothing anybody can do to stop extra caravans and vehicles being brought onto the site, but then you might say in law there's nothing to stop somebody murdering somebody. What happens is the consequences of the action that you take, if you like, illegally. Yeah? And in this case, if you say that, you know, no more than 2 mobile homes and 2 tourers, and a third, fourth tourer turns up, likely chances that the council's enforcement officer would visit the applicants and point out to them they don't have permission for those extra caravans. That's happened on other sites, and what we found in some of those cases, they have visiting family and friends. There might be a wedding or a funeral or something, and temporarily somebody is there for, say, a long weekend. But if it has permanence, looks like they're looking to, say, take advantage and intensify the site, then they'd have to either make a planning application or we'd have to take enforcement action. We'd have to consider that, and we'd see where that goes. I think that was the question about monitoring, Chairman, if I've covered that, I think.
What happens after 5 years?
Oh, yes. After 5 years, then obviously the permission would lapse. But we don't know. We haven't got a crystal ball as to where we will be with a local plan allocation. Now, the way the officer's recommendation is framed is that if you imagine when you specify a temporary time period, you've got to have a date in mind as to why you've chosen, say, 5 years, 7 years, 3 years, whatever. Rather than sort of just pick a date to hand, there has to be a reason, justification behind it. Now, in the case of Holbridge Road, the inspector felt that it would take 5 years to get a allocation perhaps through your emerging local plan, and then that site would have to get planning permission and then be built. So he's allowed, in his estimation, a period of 5 years to achieve that. Now, what would happen here is that when the 5 years, if that's what members decide is granted, their permission would lapse. But these people have agents, and what they normally recommend is if there's no chance of the council having provided a site or a site being available as an alternative, they might then make a new application to renew that consent, or just putting another application to butt up to it in timescales, and then you'd be able to consider that as and when and in the circumstances that arise. I hope that's clear, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Shaw. Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. Just one for the officers. If RDC do get a permanent Travis site within the 5 years, will Mr and Mrs O'Connor be given 6 months to remove themselves off the site to the permanent site and then put all it back to how it is now? And will the residents on the site as it is now be named so we know exactly who is on that site? And as other concerns have been, that no other travellers will actually be living on it. Thank you.
Take Councillor Gooding's question as well.
Thank you, Chair. I was just interested to know, with the day room, what materials would that be? Would that be a permanent fixture, the building, because it does have a pitched roof? So then if that is passed, that would be a permanent feature.
Chairman, yes, it's a brick building and tiled, similar to a sort of a large garage in size. You see them actually on holiday camp sites, you know, the sort of like ablutions blocks that you have. It'd be a building like that. It's quite usual on a gypsy site. I don't know if some members remember when we went to the site near Colchester United, and some members may have been on that trip, and that each pitch had a base static Atura and then its own day room on the site. In terms of naming the occupants, it is possible, if you like, with the applicant's consent, to detail who is on the site. Currently, the council's enforcement officer has reasonable contact with the applicants. The problem you have in the gypsy community sometimes is that they name, the son follows the father's name, so if you take a specific name, you're almost like you've got to say, you'll see in the inspector's decisions where they have aged the person. But you'll see that the condition that we've recommended to you is one of the sort of standard ones that the planning inspectorate use, and what they have covered is that it be used by the applicant and his wife, who are named there, but the important bit is their resident dependents.
Yeah.
Because what can happen is that the gypsy community, they may have a relative, say a parent or a grandparent, come and live with them because of illness or something like that, and then if you're not careful, that person, although they need to be resident there, they wouldn't be lawful to it, and there'd be questions as to why you need to name everybody so precisely, rather than as the planning inspectorate do, where they say, well, look, there's the, if you like, the parent applicants, then there's the dependents. What you can really control is the number of caravans, which is perhaps more specific.
Thank you.
Want to come back, Councillor Weston?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. On looking at the plans, and I'm looking at the plans on here, either side of that pitch is, I noticed one side is probably just land with nothing on it, but what on the other side? You've got like those two yellows, are they houses, buildings, or what exactly are they next to the site, please?
Chairman, these are agricultural type buildings. My belief, familiarity with the site, this is a local thatching, local thatcher that's been around a number of years, unless he's sold the site, but they're agricultural buildings, they're barns and sheds, and it's my belief that what he does on the local farmland, he uses the old machinery, the binders, the sort of drawn agricultural machines that cut wheat into sheaves for thatching. A modern combine harvester can't do that. And he's been based there a number of years, but given that he's been there a number of years, I don't know if he is now retired, but that was definitely his base when I was a kid.
Sir Wilson?
Thanks, Chair. There's a couple of points I'd like to ask. One is about paragraph 37, the cesspit, and also condition 7. Was that, presumably that cesspit was in existence before the people occupied the site? Was the first part of the question. And is that cesspit connected to any other property? And then following on from that, what's the distance to the nearest inhabited property? Because you mentioned that the two buildings there are farm buildings. What's the actual physical distance? Thank you.
Councillor Hookway, do you want to make your point, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I just wanted to ask the officer if this application is refused, therefore it goes back to enforcement, I take it, and that enforcement would look to remove all occupation of the site in due course. Is that correct?
Chairman, dealing with the last first, the enforcement notice that is on the site and stop notice is currently against the hard standing, because at the time that the development began, those were the works that were in place. What's since happened is obviously the mobile homes have come onto the site. Now, depending on your decision tonight, if you were to refuse the application, it would be then logical to serve an enforcement notice against the activity that's on the site. Notice would have to be prepared and served, okay? It's not unusual that, as in the case of the Watery Lane site that we talked about, that the owner then say, well, I've bought the land, I'm committed to the land, I'm already moved on. They then appeal, they challenge your enforcement notice. And one of the grounds is that permission should be granted. There are other grounds about the reasonableness of compliance and things, but the one to be mindful of is that, if you like, the planning argument. And that's why those two decisions that I've mentioned in my presentation are significant. One of them was against enforcement notice. The Watery Lane one was against an enforcement notice under what we call Ground A, but there was also a sister planning application alongside that. But that enforcement notice would seek the cessation of the unauthorised use. Depending on your reasoning, the notice has to be backed up by reasoning, and we would seek that from you in the decision if that's the way that you go. In terms of the cesspool, I've seen it. It's roughly located about here, and the applicant has rather discovered it as he's been on site. I think he's been using it for a week or more. But it was there, it seems the history of this site, that the previous owner used it for many, many years as some kind of leisure use, and they've particularly used this part of the site. But we understand that there may have been a caravan maybe 30 years ago down this corner. It's only hearsay and what some of the locals, I believe, have said, but it's likely that that cesspool is there because of that caravan. Now, the council's drainage engineer has tipped trace dye into the tank. We did that on Monday, and he will see if it percolates out or where it may go. But without excavating everywhere like an archaeologist and trying to find where it goes, we don't know if there are other connections. What's currently connected to the site is the 2 mobile homes and the Tourer. Prior to that, the applicant had the portaloos like you see in events or on building sites.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you to sum up before we go to a vote in a moment. I look at this application and read through the various issues that have been raised and listen to the speaker that we've had, and I have a great deal of empathy with the points that are made. However, as chairman of the committee, I need to deal with the factual elements of it. And the reality is, this council does not have alternative sites available. We have the principle of them outlined in our core strategy, but the likelihood of them being delivered within 5 years is slim at this moment in time, and there are issues around the site and its deliverability anyway. We have 2 recent inspector decisions. They've been closely argued, independently viewed, and on both occasions the decisions have gone against us. I believe that our training, the decisions, the status of our core strategy does force our hand on this one, and I think that the approval that is suggested is the only viable way forward with us this evening. But members, you've all had a opportunity to speak. Councillor Arno, you asked to come back, and I'll let you do that before we have a vote. So, just a quick question.
Thank you, Chairman. It's more of a quick statement, perhaps. Thank you for summing up. I take a slightly different view in respect that I view the protection of Greenbelt probably as a higher priority. There seems to be a number of variations and differences in this particular site to other previous examples, and I think it may be fair, and I think there's probably good reason to say that if this does get taken to a government inspector, the council could be seen to be doing so, taking the decision of refusing this as a reasonable course of action, and therefore we could the inspector may take a different view than what has happened previously. So we could potentially not be putting the council at risk, and we may get a decision slightly different from what we've had before.
Of course, anything's possible. Councillor Arno, then.
Chairman, thank you for allowing me to come back. After listening to the debate and also the officer in question, I'd like to put a motion to the table, which I'll be seeking support from the planning officer in the amendment of the recommendation is formally put together. The first point, the planning permission should be granted for a temporary 5 years. The reason I'm saying that is based on the other inspector decisions which have been made on our other sites, and also the points raised by our officer that a temporary 5 years is granted. Point 2, this is underpinned by Section 106 legal argument, which stipulates that in the event that an authorised traveller's site becomes available within, again, 5 years period, the occupier vacates the site within the period to be agreed. Point 3, in addition, the occupier agrees to submit a landscaping scheme, which I mentioned earlier in my original speech earlier, to ensure that the site is returned to its original condition. Point 4, and this is where I would seek a recommendation from the officer. Now, in the event that the legal agreement is not signed within a certain period of we could say 6 weeks, a month, 2 months from the date of this resolution to grant planning permission, the enforcement team, could they take, or I should say, the enforcement team can take the appropriate action. Now, I've made notes here based off the discussions and your summary, Chairman, and I believe this may be a way forward rather than approving the way forward by approving the planning, but with these amendments attached to it.
Okay. Right, members, before I can ask you to take any sort of decision on these, we need clarity over them. So the first item was about five-year temporary permission. That's already in the recommendation. I believe that the item about landscaping is adequately covered as item 6 within the proposed approval for site details of proposed landscaping. So that leaves us with the 3 items, 106, vacation of the site, enforcement timescale. Could you just say what you were saying? Do you want to go on the 106 bit?
Chairman, if I may. The Section 106, to limit the occupiers, you'll see that there is a... Chairman, you'll see that the requirement of the Section 106, advocated by members to make it personal, and that they vacate the site, you'll see that is covered by Condition 2. Now, firstly, what should happen is you either cover it by an agreement, if that's what you prefer, or a condition, rather than duplicate both. That's something that the government is very vexed about. You do it by one or two means. You don't belt and braces. But what their advice is also, if it can be done by a condition, then that should be the preferred route. But it's members' choice as to whether they, rather than deal with it under Condition 2, Condition 3, about the clearance of the site, if they prefer it to be a legal agreement, you'd have to strike out Condition 3, when the land ceases and the duration. That's a choice that you have. Now, the second point about signing an agreement in 6 weeks, I'm sure my colleagues at the end of the bench had a shock there. I believe the fastest legal agreement ever was dealt with in 2 months. Some of them take 2 years. average-wise, and Bex will correct me if I'm wrong, I think is that about 6-9 months, something like that. You have to get people to sign, draft them, etc. And if I have a little dig, the way solicitors work, I think if members are of a mindset that they want an agreement fast and signed and completed, nothing was ever signed legally that worked well in haste. And I think there should be a reasonable time, far more greater than, say, 6 weeks. I think you should look for a longer period of time, because at the end of the day, that may be challenged, and you want to go possibly for a judge or somebody over this that would then say, well, why, 6 weeks is an awful short time, rather, to complete a legal matter of complexity like this. So I'd advise you to think of a longer term than 6 weeks, and so maybe my colleagues would help me with that. And that then brings us on to the enforcement team taking action if the agreement isn't signed. You remember that the enforcement operation works on expediency if, in accordance with government advice and rules, that it is reasonable for them to take that action. Clearly, local people and others see breaches of Greenbelt as reason enough, and that may be the sentiment of this committee right now. But you have to go in a more measured rate, and to come in hard like that, if it's challenged by the applicant, as the council, he could argue, is being unreasonable in being so quick and forcing this, you could end up either possibly in a court or possibly before a government inspector. So I would just say a more measured approach is the way that it works. I don't know if my legal colleagues want to concur with that, or whether they want to disregard, to offer an alternative.
Chair, what I will say is that in terms of 106, certainly they are usually, as I'm sure this committee will be aware, dealing with matters in terms of infrastructure to make the development more acceptable. In terms of this matter, you're seeking to limit the time scale, which already appears to be done by way of the condition. I'm not sure that a 106 is actually the appropriate mechanism in this case, and would concur that a condition as set out already would be the more appropriate manner to deal with this. I am aware, dealing with temporary permissions, which this is, the section dealing with that does give also an indication that it should be for a specified period, rather than one that would be adjusted under the 106 as you're suggesting. So that does give me some concern. For that reason, I don't feel that it would be the appropriate course of action to take, certainly when the condition is there. I would concur timescales on 106s can be dependent on a lot of external factors. It wouldn't be possible for me to give you a timescale as to how long it would take to complete an agreement.
Thank you. I think, given the officer's advice, what I'll do is I'll move the approval from the chair as stated and printed for members to either support or not, as the case may be. If members choose not to support, then there'll need to be another vote on another motion put forward with the terms. So we've had a detailed argument. We've had the detail, and it's been quite a technical discussion. Those members in favour of the approval as printed on page 10.19, please indicate. Okay, that's 2. Those against? Right. The motion for approval is rejected. I therefore invite a member of the committee to put forward an alternative proposal.
You caught me on the hop. Pardon? You caught me on the hop. The planning permission, which we've granted for a temporary five years, and I appreciate it's in the document itself, but I think it needs to be stated or stated within the recommendations itself. Sorry?
Sorry, yeah, carry on.
Now, I agree with what the legal teams have said about the 106, but I still feel strongly that we should actually stipulate a 5-year period that the occupier vacates the site within a given period to be agreed. Now, I asked my learned gentlemen colleagues for some input here from their own experience, but I agree that the landscaping scheme, yes, it is within the report, but the sign as a first, and also to protect RDC going forward for other sites, I still believe that we should actually put a legal agreement together to ensure that 6 weeks is nonsense, to be recommended by the legal team from the date of this resolution, and to ensure that again, to decide whether the enforcement team will take the appropriate action if that is not adhered by.
Okay, Councillor, mind if Councillor Hookway comes in at this point? Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. I didn't understand that there's a specific proposal within that. I don't know if I'm wrong.
Normally what happens in these circumstances is it's the flip side of the coin that is the way forward.
Well, I can perhaps maybe simplify the matter by providing a proposal. I propose that the application is refused on the grounds of inappropriate development in the Greenbelt.
Okay. Do you have a seconder for that?
I'll second it.
Councillor Shaw will second that. Okay, thank you. Do you want to say anything about the reason, or no? No? Okay. No. Okay. Right, members, we now have an alternative motion for refusal. This has been put forward and seconded on terms of the impact on the green belt. Those members in favour of the refusal, please indicate. Those against? Thank you. That item is refused. Thank you very much for your time and attendance this evening.